Hello everyone, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about the validity and the reliability of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Now, if you're somebody who has either any background in psychology or you've worked with the MBTI or its theories before, you've probably heard people, even educated people, say that the MBTI is neither a valid or reliable personality assessment and that essentially it's not scientific. But I'm here today to actually challenge that idea, and we're going to look at some of the research that I think supports the idea that the MBTI is not only a valid and reliable personality assessment, but that it has been used for more than 20 to 30 years and is backed by not only individual peer review, but meta-analysis as well. So today we're going to be going through a few of those studies, talking about the pros and cons, the strengths and the weaknesses of the MBTI system through the lens of peer review and research. Let's see what it has to say. Let's get into it. When we're talking about the validity and the reliability of the MBTI, we need to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. This is something that I see even people with psychology degrees mess up when they're critiquing the MBTI. If you type in MBTI test on Google, you're not going to get the real MBTI test, especially if you go to different websites that are attempting to give you a free version of the assessment. The MBTI assessment, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, is just that. It is an indicator test. It's an actual assessment. This is not the MBTI. This is not the MBTI. This is not the MBTI, and none of these are used in any actual research related to the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. This is the MBTI, or at least this is the form that you will get at the end of the assessment. Now, I can't show you the actual assessment because it's a paid assessment that has to be administered by someone who is a certified practitioner, or you can take it from their website for a fee. Essentially, it's copyright protected. I can't show you the assessment, but the actual assessment is something that is a real personality test that has research associated with it. And that is not something that we're going to see when we type in MBTI test for free online or these sorts of things. And I've seen people attempt to critique the MBTI after taking things that are clearly not the Myers-Briggs assessment. So today, as we go through this research, know that we're talking about the MBTI assessment and not these kind of fake online tests that you're going to see associated with the MBTI, even if they're going to attempt to give you an MBTI type by the end. Part of what I'm proposing today is not only is the bias against MBTI due to its validity and reliability not really warranted or justified, in my opinion, but also it's creating a circular feedback loop where people don't want to use the MBTI because they falsely think that it's not valid or reliable, and therefore it doesn't get used in research, and therefore people don't want to talk about their experiences with it, and they won't even report if they're using it. To exemplify this, here's a quote from a meta-analysis looking at MBTI. Thompson 1994 stated, "One sloppy practice is not calculating, reporting, and interpreting the reliability of one's own score for one's own data." Authors of 119, 56% of the available studies involving administration of the MBTI never even mentioned the word reliability in their articles. Some researchers who had administered more than one instrument in their study mentioned or even obtained reliabilities in hand for the other instruments while ignoring the MBTI. One example of this was Parker and Mills, 1998, who had administered both the Murphy-Meisgeier, I don't know how to pronounce that, type indicator, MMTIC, and the MBTI to 152 talented 5th through 7th graders. In their Table 2 results, they listed the coefficient alphas for the MMTIC, but these same researchers failed to report any reliability coefficients for the scores obtained from the MBTI for their sample. So this is really kind of what I'm getting at before we jump into the research itself, is that there's this bias against the MBTI, despite the fact that people are using it in research. We're not seeing people publish research involving the reliability or the validity of it, and it's because they're afraid of critiques or comments from their peers, and this creates this negative feedback loop where all of the psychologists and the people out there who are working with these systems in research are just not doing what they should be doing. They're not acting in good faith according to their research, and they're missing out on the potential to use an assessment that could be helpful to them in their research because there's inherently a bias against the system that is not justified through the research. And we're going to look at that research here in just a moment, but I wanted to bring this up as a point before we get into the rest of the video because I think it's important to recognize how this negative bias is actually restricting people from thinking on their own and doing what could be potentially beneficial to them or their research. When you're looking at research to determine whether or not something is valid or reliable, there is a hierarchy of how important essentially these studies can be. So what you typically want to look for first on a topic is going to be a meta-analysis or a systematic review. And this essentially is a study in and of itself that looks at all of the other studies, or a majority of other studies associated with the thing that it is attempting to determine the validity or reliability of, and then kind of aggregates all that data or all of the information from those into one study itself that will kind of give you a general overview of the validity or reliability. Now, under that is where you would find things like individual assessments of validity or reliability, case studies, these sorts of things. So today we're going to be looking at meta-analysis and systematic review, and we'll also take a look at some individual studies that might support or even go against the MBTI, because in the effort of fairness, I'm also going to be looking at some negative peer reviews of the MBTI, because I don't want you to leave this video thinking that the MBTI is some pure, holy, perfect personality assessment, but I do want you to leave knowing that there is research that supports this system and the theories that it proposes. So knowing that meta-analysis and systematic review are really what you're going to be aiming for if you're really trying to understand the validity and reliability of something, today I'm going to present 3 meta-analysis and or systematic review that are going to discuss the MBTI. Now, if you're not a researcher, you're not someone who wants to read through huge research papers with tons of numbers that you're probably not going to understand, one good habit that you can develop if you're trying to really understand the science of something is to check the abstract and then to check the results and discussion section of something, because the average layman is not going to be able to understand the numbers section of a lot of these papers. Even someone with a psychology degree like myself is going to struggle sometimes to understand the complex stuff, because I don't have a graduate degree and a lot of this is graduate level research. So the first meta-analysis that we're going to look at is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Score Reliability Across Studies, a meta-analytic reliability generalization study. That is a mouthful. Published in 2002. Now I've got it, the full PDF up here, but we're going to look at the abstract first. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator was submitted to a descriptive reliability generalization (RG) analysis to characterize the variability of measurement error in MBTI scores across administrations. In general, the MBTI in its scales yielded scores with strong internal consistency and test-retest reliability estimates, although variation was observed. Now, the good habit to get into, if you see something that's in support of something that you want to understand, you should check the results and discussion section at the very least of that paper to make sure you can understand what it means when they say something like, although variation was observed. So now I would go over to the PDF, I'd scroll down to the results discussion section. Usually near the end, they're going to talk about these things as kind of a summary to the paper. So we can read the final paragraph here. The administrations of the MBTI examined in the present study indicated that the MBTI, on average, tends to yield scores with acceptable reliability across studies. But like all measures, the MBTI yields scores that are dependent on sample characteristics and testing conditions. Despite acceptable reliability coefficient estimates overall, one study reported an unacceptable test-retest coefficient of 0.48. This coefficient and others exemplifies that the most relevant reliability estimate for a study is the reliability coefficient computed on the data at hand. As Henson et al. Commented, the best evidence of adequate score reliability for one's own data is to actually compute it, a process that takes at least a minute with modern computing capabilities. Now, this is actually kind of making fun of or critiquing some of the researchers that were mentioned a moment ago in the same paper, talking about how they weren't reporting their own scores and their own reliabilities. But in general, when you're looking at this specific meta-analysis, this specific study, you can see that there is support for the idea that MBTI is a reliable, at the very least, assessment. Essentially, it is measuring consistently what it is attempting to measure, and it talks a little bit about the validity, but there's other papers that we can talk about. There's other analysis that focus more on validity that we'll get into that. But this specific study supports the idea that the MBTI, at the very least, from a meta-analysis perspective, is reliable. Another good practice to get into when you're looking at the reliability and validity of something is to make sure that you have at least semi-recent or up-to-date research. So that study that we just looked at, even though it is somewhat new, it is from 2002. So that's about 20 years ago at this point, which, wow, it doesn't seem like that long. But either way, that is kind of what we would call a dated research paper in some terms, and that it's been a while, and there's probably something that's come between now and then that could give us a better look at this topic, or at least a more up-to-date look at the topic. So next up is a 2017 paper, which is within 5 years, which is generally considered acceptable if you're looking at research. Validity and reliability of the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator, a systematic review and meta-analysis. So, I actually have this up twice. Abstract. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is frequently used by health professionals and educational programs to address the diversity of personalities that exist. No systematic review of literature or meta-analysis of its validity and reliability has occurred. That's not true because we just looked at one actually, but maybe they weren't talking about the exact same type of thing. This is comprehensive literature search identified 221 potential studies, of which 7 met our inclusion criteria. So important thing to note as a researcher, 7 is not a ton when you're doing a meta-analysis, but because of the same problem that we just talked about in the previous study, a lot of researchers weren't reporting their own reliabilities even when they were using the MBTI assessment. And that's kind of what's leading to this feedback loop of these researchers who are doing the meta-analysis and the systematic review don't have enough data, or I mean, in this case they do, because 7 is still technically enough to do the analysis, but they would be better off if more people would report their information, despite the fact that they're using this assessment, they're using the MBTI, they're not reporting their reliability and validity scores, and it would be more beneficial to research and science in the future if they did. 4 of the studies examined construct validity, but their varying methods did not permit pooling for meta-analysis. These studies agree that the instrument has reasonable construct validity. The 3 studies of test-retest reliability did allow meta-analysis to be performed, albeit with caution due to substantial heterogeneity. Sorry, it's a hard word to pronounce. Results indicate that the extrovert, introvert, sensing, intuition, and judging, perceiving subscales have satisfactory reliabilities of 0.75 or higher, and that the thinking, feeling subscale has a reliability of 0.61. The majority of studies were conducted on college-age students, thus the evidence to support the tool's utility applies more to this group, and careful thought should be given when applying it to other individuals. So essentially what this is saying is that they were able to find a small handful of studies that were able to be used, and across these studies, satisfactory reliability / validity was reported. And what's the difference between satisfactory and something like exemplary? So you see the scores 0.75 and 0.61. Now, anything above a 0.5 a lot of the times in reliability or even validity, depending on which model or method of analysis you're using, is going to be considered acceptable. You know, it goes from 0 to 1, with 1 being the best score that you can have in a lot of these measurements. So something like a 0.75, you would think, oh, like 7.5, that's okay. 7.5 is actually pretty good. It's not like amazing, but it's pretty good. 0.61 is acceptable. So what's the difference between something that's acceptable and something that's like pseudoscience? Well, pseudoscience would be something down in the 0.5s, or 0.05s, the 0.1s, the 0.2s. These very low reliability and validity scores are going to be something that's more akin to pseudoscience and not reflective of anything that is actually being measured consistently. But with scores like this, we can at the very least see that there is some consistency, reliability, and validity here that is being measured. Now, with a study like this, we do wish that there was more studies that could have been included in the final analysis. But again, because of the issue of reporting when it comes to using the MBTI, we're not able to see that. And they had to do what they could to give consistent data with the small amount of information that they were given. I mentioned earlier that I had 3 meta-analysis / systematic review that I wanted to go over, but I actually only have 2. The third one wasn't what I thought it was, and it's not relevant to this conversation, so I had to scrap it. So instead, we're going to go over some individual assessments of validity and reliability, some individual research. The first one that we're going to go over is an older study, but it is the first thing that shows up, and it is the most cited, from 1984 by Tzeng, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, item validity of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Now, I don't have access to the full paper for this one because my academic institution wouldn't give me access to this specific one for some reason, so we're going to have to just work with the abstract here. So, analysis of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator MBTI data from 444 college students and clerical employees showed that although the average interim correlations within the 4 MBTI scales were relatively low, reliability coefficients were rather high. Empirically derived factors almost perfectly matched the theoretical scales. A strong negative correlation was found between the poles of each MBTI dimension. That's a good thing. And interscale correlations were insignificant. Results support the item validity of the MBTI. So essentially, this is another assessment that's saying, or another research study that's saying that there is some validity to the MBTI and the items associated with it. Now, we're going to go through a few more, but I do want to make sure that before the video ends that we go over some negative, or at least critiques of the MBTI as well, so we could talk about some of the negative aspects. So let's go through 2 more. Unfortunately, these other 2, I could not get access to the full paper either, so we're just going to have to deal with the abstract. If you have access to these and you'd like to send me a PDF by email, I'd be more than happy to read them there, but unfortunately, I have to deal with just the abstract. But I think the abstract is generally going to tell us the idea of the paper and what it is attempting to support anyway. So this one is the MBTI and social information processing. This is not relevant because we're looking for validity specifically related to the item or the assessment itself and not in relation to something else. So we're going to skip down to second order factor structure of the MBTI, a construct validity assessment. So this is a very short abstract. It's not a full abstract. So again, in the sake of honest and good faith research, we should take this and the next one with a grain of salt because we only have access to the abstract. But factor, adequacy, and other results based on data from 359 college students provided positive evidence regarding the validity of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So second order factor structure of the MBTI construct validity assessment supports the idea of the validity of the MBTI assessment. And then we will go down to construct validity of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is actually more cited than the one that I found earlier. It is a 1986 study. Let's see what it has to say. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, is widely recognized as an important measure of normal or non-pathological variations in personality. However, the construct validity of the measure has not been clearly established using factor analytic techniques. The present study investigated the structure and item performance of the instrument using data from 359 college students. Factor analysis was applied to the 95 scored MBTI items. Factor adequacy and invariance coefficients were computed, and the appropriateness of the recommended item weights was examined. The results strongly supported the instrument's construct validity. So again, this is another study, yet another study, that is supporting the idea that there is validity to the Myers-Briggs assessment. So now let's talk about the downsides of MBTI in relation to its research, because there are downsides. The biggest downside that you're going to see when it comes to people critiquing the MBTI and its validity and reliability is not what it is measuring or how it's measuring it. It's the idea of having a personality type, essentially a categorization of a personality. Now, there is a huge miscommunication in the idea that people, when they look at MBTI, they think, oh, if I'm an ENTP, that means I can't do anything else. Briggs explicitly refers to these things as preferences. So if you're an intuitive type, it means you have a stronger preference for intuition over sensing, not that you are unable to do things in the realm of sensing. So essentially, while you do have a type, it is not meant to put you into a box that says you can only do these things. It says these are your strong preferences, and they're going to be a reflection of who you are a majority of the time. Now, what do I mean by people are going to critique it for being a type or having a type instead of being a scale or a spectrum of scores? One example that I like to use, and this is actually a really important paper if you're someone who studies MBTI research, is reinterpreting the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator from the perspective of the five-factor model of personality. This comes from a famous Big Five researcher, and a quote here that we're going to look over is, "The results of the present study provide the basis for a very mixed evaluation or a radical reinterpretation of the MBTI, consistent with much previous research. The study found no support for the typological theory the instrument is intended to embody. There was no evidence that the preferences formed true dichotomies. The 16 types did not appear to be qualitatively distinct because analysis of their joint effects on personality dimension showed that only 1 of 55 interactions was significant, and only in women, and contrary to hypothesis, the theoretical dominant function was no more clearly preferred than the auxiliary." Now, this is a mess if you're looking at this as someone who understands MBTI and research in general, because not only is this coming from someone who has a bias or preference for Big Five, which isn't inherently a big thing. This researcher has a personal stake in Big Five. They're also attempting to measure the assessment in and of itself as well as the functions, whereas the functions are not part of the MBTI actual assessment. Essentially, the MBTI assessment does not propose that there are these cognitive functions that it is attempting to measure. It is instead saying, here are types, and then the functions are an extension of that are not being measured by the test. They're essentially an alternative way of viewing the type, the result that you get from the assessment. So what we can see from this critical analysis is that researchers are more so concerned with the idea that there is a personality type. And we could argue all day about whether or not you have a type or whether you don't have a type. But again, I go back to the idea that Briggs proposed that there were preferences, not specific things that only you can do or you can only do, and you can never do the other side. It's more so this is who you are a majority of the time. And I think that is something that is missed when we look at MBTI as a system, when we look at it as a model. It's that just because you are a specific type doesn't mean you can't do all these other things. One way that I like to think about it is that, if I'm left-handed as an individual, does that mean that I can't write with my right hand? No. Does it mean that if when I try to write with my right hand, it might look a little sloppier? Yes. And that's the same approach that MBTI takes to personality, is that you are not categorized explicitly into one box, and you can never interact with any other aspects of your personality outside of that box. Like if you're an introvert, you can just never go out and enjoy a party or anything like that. It means that you're not going to have a natural preference for those things. And when you go to do those things, it might be a little bit awkward. It might be a little bit difficult for you. It might be something that you have to develop as a personality trait within yourself. But that's consistently what the research is going to show when you look at the downsides of MBTI in relation to the research, at least. Now, there are other studies that talk about maybe some of the downsides of MBTI, why it's difficult for it to be used in certain scenarios. We could look at here, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, some psychometric limitations, reviews the psychometric adequacy of the MBTI. There is a need for the development of valid and comprehensive local norms to increase its predictability and utility within the Australian context. Now, this is apparently specifically in relation to Australia. There are a number of psychometric limitations pertaining to the reliability and validity of the MBTI that raise concerns about its use by practitioners. Routine use of the MBTI is not recommended, and psychologists should be cautious as to its likely misuse in various organizational and occupational settings. So one of the things that this talks about here is the validity and reliability within the context of the specific group that you're working with, which is what that study that we reviewed quite some time ago talked about, how it's important to kind of have a local norm, a local reliability, local validity to understand how the assessment is going to vary maybe from culture to culture, these sorts of things, which the Big Five does way better than the MBTI. The Big Five has a much better representation of norms. But across the board, the point here is that yes, there are downsides to the MBTI, but it doesn't come from the idea that the MBTI is not valid or not reliable as a whole. It's that in specific circumstances, it might lose some of its validity and reliability. And researchers are not convinced of the idea of a personality type. But to those researchers, I would instead suggest to look at it through the lens of a preference instead of a specific type, a concrete thing that you are and can never not be. For those of you who are still skeptical about MBTI, I want to show you one very little known thing about MBTI before we wrap up this video, before I end things. And that's what's known as the MBTI Step 2. And essentially, over the past 20 to 30 years, the MBTI has recognized some of the mistakes in their attempt to create a valid and reliable assessment, and they've attempted to move it on to the next level. Now, there isn't a whole lot of research associated with the Step 2 because people barely know it exists, but I really like this assessment. I think it's one of the best personality assessments that you can get on the market right now, and it's one of the best things that you can use when attempting to understand yourself. So when you take the MBTI Step 2, at the end of the assessment, you're still going to get a personality type, but you're also going to see within each of the 4 letters, the 4 categories, 5 subcategories that represent traits of that trait or subtraits of that trait. So right now we're looking at sensing versus intuition. So this is just one letter of your 4-letter code, and we have 5 categories within it. And as an individual, you can score what's called in preference, mid-zone, or out of preference for these things. And now you get a better look at your individual specific personality traits that represent each of these categories. So for example, let's say in this example, we have a sensing type. This is someone with a stronger preference for sensing. Concrete versus abstract. They have a generally stronger preference for concrete things over abstraction. Practical versus conceptual. They have a complete preference for practical versus conceptual, as well as experiential versus theoretical. But if you look down here, traditional versus original, they have an out of preference for being original over traditional. So despite the fact that they are a sensing type and they have a strong preference for sensing associated things, they have an out of preference for one of those 5 things, which gives them a better understanding of how their preference is going to differ from maybe someone else who also has the same personality type or the same preference. And this here is an exact representation of what it means to have a type, and that you are not locked in to your personality type in the way that you can never extend beyond it. You cannot have traits that are not representative of your individual personality. And in fact, MBTI is attempting to show you specifically how your personality can be different from others, how it can be unique, and how it can evolve over time within these preferences, and what that means for you. You can look down here at the bottom. It'll give you examples of what it means to be in preference or out of preference, and we can see the one that's out of preference, original, looks for what could be better, new, or different, likes being original or different, but not so much as to be out of the mainstream, are often seen as both creative and practical, may occasionally surprise others by going off in a new, different direction. So that's not only is being out of preference, interesting because it's part of your type, but being out of preference is a different score in and of itself than being an intuitive and being in preference. So if you're an intuitive and you're original, you might be going against you might be not surprising others because you go against the new so often. It's just generally who you are. But this is something that's out of preference, and therefore it's kind of this unique trait about your personality. So that's really what I want to end the video on. I hope you've enjoyed this kind of dive into personality, MBTI, its validity and reliability. I hope you can at least take something away from this video. And the one thing that I want you to recognize is that the MBTI is not a perfect assessment. It is not some hyper rigorous scientific model, but it's extremely useful, it's extremely helpful, and I think that if people took the time to understand it, I think if psychologists and researchers took the time to look into this assessment and understand what it is attempting to show and represent, they could realize that there's a lot of value in the MBTI that is really just going unutilized because people are afraid to use this assessment. They're afraid to speak their mind about what they think of the assessment in relation to its use to their peers in psychology. And that's one thing that I don't want to do as I move forward towards getting my PhD, is I don't want to hide the fact that I think this is a great assessment with a lot of utility that I think can be extremely helpful for people. And I hope one day that maybe other psychologists might be able to recognize the utility and the benefit that the MBTI could have for them or their research. Thanks for watching.